This is R.K. Mishra going to teach you the nuts and bolts of English literature, which is very, very important for UGC and other TGT and PGT level exams. I have been teaching at Kalp Institute for several years. Well, I am going to start with the classification of English literature. Dear students, for the sake of understanding English literature in a very clear-cut manner, you need to know what is called classification. The English literature has been divided into three periods. The first one is the Old English period. The first one is the Old English period. It covers the period from 450 to 1066. This is the period that usually spans from 450 to 1066. Secondly, we have to discuss the medieval English period. This spans from 1066 to 1500. And the third one is the modern English, which actually spans from 1500 to till date. Well, let me start with the Old English. It has nothing to do with our exams. Only two dates are very, very important, that is 450 and 1066. The next thing that we have to discuss here is the medieval English period. It is sub-classified into three parts. The first part is generally known as the dawn of medieval English, and this covers the period 1066 to 1350. Then comes the age of Chaucer, and this covers the period of 1350 to 1400. Dear students, here I would like to make you understand one important fact, that an age is generally named behind two things. Either it is named after the most important writer of the period, or it is named after the king or queen of the age. Here, Chaucer was the most important writer of the period, and that's why the age is named after him. Thereafter, there is the decline of the medieval English, and this spans from 1400 to 1560. This is where the medieval English ends. And the third important classification of the period of English literature is the modern English. This starts with 1500 and continues till date. The very first thing in this regard that I would like to discuss is the Renaissance. And the period of the Renaissance is from 1558 to 1660. 1558 to 1660. Here I would like to sub-classify the period. The Renaissance is divided into three parts. The first one is the dawn of Renaissance. The dawn of Renaissance. And this covers the period 1558, 1500 to 1578. Next comes the flowering of Renaissance. The flowering of Renaissance. And this covers the period, which I will make you understand later, but let me here make you understand the sub-classification of the period of the flowering of Renaissance. This is sub-classified into two parts. The first part is known as the Elizabethan age. The Elizabethan age that usually spans from 1558 to 1603. And then comes the Jacobean age. And this is 1603 to 1625. Here I would like to connect you with the part that I later taught you, that is flowering of Renaissance. As I made you understand already that I'll discuss it later, here it can be spanned from 1558 to 1625. Well, what do you mean by the term Jacobean? Actually, during this period, King James I was the ruler of the England, and that is why it is from James I that the adjective Jacobean is used. You know, James I is proper noun, and here the Jacobean is used as the proper adjective of the term. Well, let's now come to the third section of Renaissance, that is the fall or decline of the Renaissance. But before this, I would like to make you understand here that the most important writer of the Jacobean age was Ben Jonson. That's why the period is also known as the age of Ben Jonson. As regards the fall or decline of Renaissance, here also I would like to sub-classify the period. Its first classification is the Caroline age, that is from 1625 to 1649, as the ruler of the period was King Charles I. That is why the period is actually known as the Caroline. As I already made you understand that Jacobean age, the adjective of James I. Similarly, Caroline age, the adjective of Charles I. Well, as I turn to the second classification of this, you know, this period is also named as the Commonwealth period. And this spans from 1649 to 1660. But here there is a slight bit of variation. During this period, there came two rulers. This period is also known by the name of the Puritan age. The Puritan age, or its Latin title is the Puritan interregnum. Puritan interregnum. Here, by the word interregnum, we actually mean interval. And here let me make you understand that the very first ruler during this period was Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell. And he ruled from 1649 to 1658. And right after him, there came another ruler whose name was Richard Cromwell. He reigned only a couple of years, that is from 1658 to 1660. Well, during this age, that is Commonwealth period, I would like to make you understand one thing, that why this period was called Commonwealth period. You know, the term common, meaning Commonwealth means it is everybody's property and nobody's property. In fact, during this period, there was no ruler in England. In 1649, Charles I was executed, and thereafter there was no ruler on the throne of England. During this period, actually I was making you understand that during this period, Milton was the most important writer. And well, as I was making you understand that the term Commonwealth means everybody's property and nobody's property. Here, there was no ruler after Charles I was executed in 1649. So, somebody was to look after the throne. and that is why this authority was given to Oliver Cromwell, and he started ruling over England in a very grand manner. He took the control of the parliament, and thereby he started ruling over the England and leading England in a different direction. After this, a new age starts, and that is known as the Restoration period. The Restoration period. Well, this period spans from 1660 to what is called 1745. This period is further subclassified into three parts. The first one is known as the Restoration age. And as regards the writer of the period, the most important writer was Dryden. John Dryden, and therefore the period is named after him and so called the age of Dryden. The age spanned from 1660 to 1700. Right after the death of Dryden, another important age begins, that is the Augustan age. And Mr. Pope was the most important writer of the period. That is why this age is also known as the age of Pope. He actually reigned from 1700 to 1745, but reigned only in the literary realm. Thereafter, the third subclassification age, the age of sensibility. The age of sensibility. And this age begins with the coming of Dr. Johnson. That is why the period is also known as the age of Dr. Johnson. And this spans from 1745 to 1789. Here, I would like to discuss a few important facts. What is the meaning of restoration? Why this period is called Restoration age? In fact, it's because of various reasons, but two important reasons are there. The first thing is that it was the period of restoration of Charles II. After the death of Charles I, there was no ruler over England, and after a long gap, the rule or the throne was once again succeeded by his son, Charles II. Well, when he came to the throne, he started resuming drama in England. So it is at the same time restoration of monarchy as well as the restoration of drama. Next one, that is the Augustan age. In fact, during here I would like to take you to Rome. Just as King Augustus was the most important ruler in the Rome, in country called Rome, similarly in England also this was the most important period when the English literature actually flourished. And that is why there is a comparison between the Augustan age of Rome and English literature of 18th century, and therefore the age is termed as the Augustan age. As regards the age of sensibility, the age began to see dualism. The effect of classicism had not completely died down, and the impact of romanticism began, and it's therefore known as the age of sensibility. Right after the neoclassical period, there begins the age of transition. The age of transition. And this is known by the name of the neoclassical period. Why neoclassical? Because classicism was actually here modified, and therefore it came to be called neoclassicism. By neo we mean new. So classicism was defined from a new angle. In fact, they did not imitate the classical writers blindly, rather they started modifying them from a new angle. They were not slavish imitator, rather they were modifiers. That's why they came to be called the neoclassical writers. Well, after this, a new era begins, that is the age of transition. The age of transition. By the word transition, we mean change. As I already told you that during this period, during the previous period as well, the effect of classicism has not completely died down and the effect of romanticism had begun. So here the same kind of thing started taking place and in a very grand manner, and that is why it came to be called the age of pre-romantics. The age of pre-romantics. That means romanticism had not begun with complete spirit, but its spark had begun to rise and it began to show its flare in different senses. Gray, Collins, Robert Burns, and many others were the important writers of this period. Thereafter, the Romantic Revival started. The age of Romantic Revival. This is also known as actually the period of Romanticism. The period of Romanticism. There are two important writers during the period, that is Wordsworth and Coleridge. There were two groups of romantics. On the one hand, there were senior romantics, and on the other hand, there were junior romantics. Among the junior romantics, Keats and others were very, very important. Thereafter, the Victorian age begins. The Victorian age, and the period of this age is 1832 to 1901. In fact, the influence of romanticism had not died down completely. It continued up to 1850 when Wordsworth died. And therefore, the Victorian age is also subclassified into three parts. The early Victorians, the early Victorian age. This spans from 1832 to 1848. The next period is the mid-Victorian age. The mid-Victorian age, and this spans from 1848 to 1870. It was actually during this period that a new movement ensued or started, that is the pre-Raphaelitism. The pre-Raphaelitism, and this came during the decade of 1860. Then the decline of Victorian age. Then the decline of Victorian age, and this is from 1870 to 1901. In fact, during this period, aestheticism came into existence, and it led to the appreciation of beauty in English literature. Thereafter, the modern age begins. The modern age begins, and it started in 1901 but continued to 1945. As regards the modern age, here let me make you understand, modernity is never a question of date, but it is a question of outlook. Chaucer too was a modern writer, even though he belonged to the age of medievalism. He was a medieval writer, but still he is considered to be a modern age because he is considered to be a writer who is modern in outlook. That is why this is very important for you to understand that modernity is never a question of date, but it is a question of outlook. Whoever is modern in outlook is considered to be a modern writer, and whoever is outdated in outlook is considered to be a writer of different influence, rather the influence of medievalism or something else. Well, as we come to the modern age, what do we find? That it started in 1901 and continued to 1945. This period is also known by the name of interwar years. This period is also known by the name of the interwar years. Interwar years. It's because of the two world wars. The period came to be known as the period of interwar years. As we turn to the sub-classification of the age, we find that there is Edwardian age or period, and this is from 1901 to 1914. Second classification age of the Georgian age or the Georgian period, and this is from 1910 to 1936. And finally there is the post-modern age that begins from 1945 and continues till date. So in this class we have basically discussed the classification of modern period and the classification of English literature. Let me here clarify that for the sake of convenience of understanding the period in a much better manner, you will have to understand this in a very clear-cut manner, because questions are generally given from this sector and therefore you need to understand it in a proper manner. Its concept will make everything easier, and you will be able to know that what you are studying, how you are studying, what you have studied, what is left, and how the things can be understood in a much depth. Well, that is why this is a very, very important chapter and class for you to understand. Let me here discuss with you or share with you an important fact. The writers of the age are also very, very important. You need to make a list of the age and thereby the writers. Well, as we come to the Chaucerian age, the most important writer is Geoffrey Chaucer. Geoffrey Chaucer, whose lifespan is 1340 to 1400. Similarly, the next is the age of King James or Jacobean age. Here the most important writer is Ben Jonson. Ben Jonson was not just a critic but a playwright, and he had other acumen as well. He was a critic and he is generally believed to have begun neoclassicism in the field of English literature. As we come to the next stage, what do we find? That Caroline age, and during this age John Milton is considered to be the most important writer of the period. Milton is famous for writing or producing the epic called Paradise Lost, which is generally acclaimed and read all over the world. The next is, that is the Restoration period. During this period, John Dryden played a major role. He is known for starting heroic tragedy, and the Restoration comedy also flourished during this period. The drama of this period is generally divided into two parts, that is heroic play and heroic tragedy. Heroic play and heroic tragedy. The difference between the two genres is that if the play ends in a happy manner, it is generally known as the heroic play, but if the protagonist of the play dies in the end, this is generally considered to be heroic tragedy. As we come to the next type of drama during this period, this is Restoration comedy. Restoration comedy. In fact, Restoration comedy is also known by a different name, that is the comedy of manners. Well, this is known as the comedy of manners because after Restoration, when the drama was resumed in England, people of the England had lost their limitations. They started turning to pleasure in a very different manner, and they started losing manners and morals. It's just because of that the Restoration comedy was written with the view of reflecting this, decline of manners and morals. Similarly, Richard Steele and Addison are also given credit for maintaining a balance over them. They tried to restrict the manners and morals of the age by reflecting this fact through their essays. Here I would like to make you understand the Richard Steele. Richard Steele is actually known for producing a well-known periodical that is known as the Tatler, which was later on followed by Joseph Addison's The Spectator. Joseph Addison's The Spectator. In fact, Tatler was followed by Spectator. Later on, Dr. Johnson too did not lag behind. He also produced two periodicals. The first one is named as Dr. Johnson produced two periodicals. The first one is known as The Rambler, and the next one is known as The Idler, which can also be arranged as TSRI. So T here stands for Tatler, S here stands for Spectator, R here stands for Rambler, and I here stands for Idler. As we turn to the next stage, that is the age of Pope, we find that the age of Pope had another brilliant writer, and his name is Jonathan Swift. Jonathan Swift. Swift is another writer of master satirical writing. He actually produced The Battle of Books. The Battle of Books. But his Gulliver's Travels is actually an immortal work which was published in 1726. This novel is divided into four parts. The first part is known as The Voyage to Lilliput, while the second one is known as The Voyage to Brobdingnag. The third one is actually known as The Voyage to Laputa, while the fourth one is known as The Voyage to Winims. In this work, Initially, it makes the reader confused that why this kind of work was produced by him. But let me make you understand here that Swift was in fact a misanthrope. By the word misanthrope, we mean the one who tries to avoid human company. So, in the first part, Swift shows the littleness of man, while in the second part, Swift shows that man can be as worse as giant. In the third part, that is the voyage to Laputa, he attacks on the works or experiments of science which was undertaken by the writers of the period. And the fourth part is a voyage to Brobdingnac. During this period, during this section, he actually tries to show that animals are much better than man. So thus, it is a satiric work which is very, very important and widely read by the people. There is a third work, that is a battle of Tup, a tale of Tup. A Tale of Tup. This work was actually produced to deviate the mind of the dissenters and others who were, involved in religious war or quarrel. He produced it to show that Christianity is in fact one, and even though there have been people who disagreed or agreed with in different senses, but ultimately everyone is a Christian and would try to follow the path to Christianity. In the next stage, there is Dr. Johnson, who produced different works like the preface to Shakespeare. Dr. Johnson, who produced the preface to Shakespeare. It is actually a critical work, and second one is the lives of the poets. This is again a critical work which established the school of biographical criticism. The next one is the transitional age. During this period, there was the writer called Thomas Gray. Thomas Gray, who produced the immortal poem An Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard. There are a good number of other writers, other poets as well during this period, and let us now come to the next age, that is the Romantic Age. The Romantic Age, that spans from 1798 to 1832. During this age, as I have already discussed with you, that there were two most important writers. The first one is Wordsworth. Wordsworth. The age of Romanticism generally begins with the publication of Lyrical Ballads, which was published in 1798, and this was a big task undertaken by Wordsworth and Coleridge. They actually worked together to publish this particular work. They worked together to publish this work, and this is how the age of Romanticism actually is said to have begun. Wordsworth produced his most cherished work, The Prelude, during this period, while Coleridge is said to have produced his most important work, that is the Biographia Literaria, which actually means biography of literature. So through this particular work, he tells the story of making of literature. Well, apart from these major romantic poets, there were junior romantics as well. Among the junior romantics, there is Keats, Byron, and Shelley. Keats is actually known for writing a good number of romantic poems, along with Hyperion and Among his famous famous poems are Lamia and a few others. In fact, Keats, in a letter to his brother called George, coined the term negative capability. Negative capability. This is a very, very important term from the point of view of examination. Here, he tried to show that the maximum influence of negative capability was on Shakespeare. And that is why, if you go through the plays of Shakespeare, you will find that Shakespeare uses one statement in a different context. Sometimes he says God is just, but in the next play he says that God is unjust. Here, you have to basically understand that it is not Shakespeare speaking, but rather character speaking. And thus here we find that he negates what he says, and thus we find negative capability in large amount in him. As we turn to Shelley, Shelley is also an important writer, and he is known as revolutionary poet, and he published a good number of poems dealing with revolutionary ideas. Similarly, there was Byron, whose most important work is considered to be Manfred. Byron, Manfred. As we come to the next age, that is Victorian age. Like Elizabethan age, this was again a great age. This was ruled actually by Queen Victoria. The age saw the development of various kinds of literature. During this age, there were essays, prose works, literary criticism, novel writing, as well as the other movements also. The Oxford movement is generally considered to be the very, very important movement of the period, which is generally started by John Keble. And among the novelists of the period, Dickens, Thackeray, and many others are very important, while Thomas Hardy is considered to be the most important writer among the novelists. Well, as we come to the modern age, it is very difficult to discuss it in one class because there were a good number of writers, and as I already shared with you that modernity is never a question of date or outlook. But if you ask me that modernity is in what sense, let me here tell you that it was the matter of technique. It was not just the matter of thematic aspect, but the matter of technique as well. Stream of consciousness style, prolepsis, ellipsis, and there were various techniques which were used in the novel. Generally, you must be knowing James Joyce, who published his most important novel, Ulysses. It is considered to be an immortal work, but this is more important from the point of view of experiment. And similarly, if we come to the postmodern age, during this period, again, the literature was highly experimental. All kinds of techniques were taken into account by the novelists. They started experimenting with historical technique. Even, history was used in the novel, while sometimes novel was written during the historical period. The fiction of the period is generally known as the metafiction because it crossed the limits of the fiction. Similarly, the heroes were not only heroes, were anti-heroes as well during the age. That's all for the class. It is with this I am going to end the class. That's all for the day. You can visit us at studykhazana.com and kalpeducation.com.